Sorry. Okay. So just to recap, today is accessible research data, and we have Kristen Briney from Caltech with us today. Very important topic. And Kristen has published a lot of books. I have at least two of them from you. And then her research focuses on research data management, institutional research data policies, and accessibility of research data. She's an advocate for consistent file naming and the adoption of the date standard, ISO 8601. And in her free time, likes to spend time doing data visualizations with Yarn. And when she comes on camera, you'll be able to see one of her excellent data visualizations behind her. So I'm going to go ahead and switch it over to you, Kristen, and
Great,
stop.
thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, give me 1 second and I will pop the chat open in another window. So if there are questions, I can hopefully see them. Okay. So thank you, Amy, for that lovely introduction. You can kind of see behind me. Let me see if I can move my webcam. There's actually 2 rows. That is my kind of morbid COVID data fatalities in the United States in 2020 and 2021. Yet I was very angry with science policy during the pandemic, so I made a visualization about it. But today we're going to be talking about accessible research data. I think, as Amy said, is a really important topic. I'm kind of hoping to give you just kind of a broad overview of what's going on and what we know about accessible data right now. If I were to talk about how to make a data accessible, that's really a talk that takes longer than an hour, that I just don't have time to get into all the details. So I'm hoping to give you kind of a broad overview and kind of show you some examples, but I'm not going to be able to share everything with you today. But before we get into it, I do want to make a distinction immediately when I talk about accessibility. And that's because when we talk about data management sharing, we often talk about FAIR data, FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But the A in FAIR is not the accessibility I'm talking about today. The A in FAIR means you can actually get it. A computer or a person can get that data. The accessible I'm talking about today, I'm going to use the definition from Cologne, Gobin, and Karcher from a couple of years ago, and they say that we understand actually accessible data to be data that is easy to locate, obtain, interpret, use, share, and analyze for everybody, including disabled people. So when I say accessible today, I'm going to be talking about disability and not about just being able to get data. So very clear distinction right from the get-go, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page about that. All right, I gave you a little bit of a kind of preview of what I was going to talk about, but let me give you a little bit of an more of an outline before we get into things. So I want to take a step back and talk about why accessibility matters, and then why that matters with respect to research data. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we know about research data accessibility and what's information's available. And that will lead right into several useful resources that you can look up right now. There's not a lot, but there's some useful stuff that you can dig into and learn about this topic more on your own. And then hopefully we'll have time. I'm planning to do it, but I want to walk you through some examples, and we'll take some examples of color, just as a general principle, and then looking at a particular data type of spreadsheets and what it looks like when you start talking about accessibility within a specific data type. And then I'm going to wrap up by some concrete steps that you can take to actually do some of this work. So, Amy gave a lovely introduction. Let me just add a few more details. As she said, I am a librarian at Caltech. My specialty is obviously being a science librarian, but I also specialize in data management and sharing. But relevant to this talk, I have long COVID. This is why I have all these feelings about COVID. And so recently I have started thinking about what disability means for me and what disability means for my work and what it means for data management sharing. And I've started to do a lot of research in the area of accessible research data. Now, there isn't a lot of information available in this area, and I'm just starting to kind of talk about it and teach about it. So if there are things that I say that you think I'm incorrect, please let me know. I want to be sharing the best information possible. I'm kind of new to disability in general, but I care a lot about it, and I want to make sure that this information that I'm sharing is correct. So let me know. All right. So let's start out by talking about why accessibility matters. And if we look just starting at straight statistics from the CDC, we can see that CDC says that 28.7% of Americans have one or more disabilities. And that number is pretty standard when you start looking at other countries. I think it's one quarter. In the UK, I've seen numbers about 20%, 25%. So, a fourth to a fifth of all people have at least one disability or more. So when you think collectively about disability, disability is actually a large group of people. It's actually the largest minority group of people, and it's a group that you can join at any time. And you probably will join the disability group over the course of your lifetime, especially as people get older and their vision is not as good as it used to be, their mobility is not as good as it used to be. You can expect that disability is going to come for us all. Um, Now, you might not realize that disability is so prevalent because not all disabilities are visible. Temporarily abled, as Deb says in the comments. Yes, we are all temporarily abled. So some people are visibly more clearly disabled. You can look at them and know they're disabled. People like me who have several chronic illnesses, it's not apparent that I am disabled unless I'm feeling ill that particular day. So you are probably surrounded by people who are disabled. You just may or may not know it because we may choose or not choose to disclose. So when we start thinking about this large group of disabled people, we realize that accessibility really matters because there's a lot of people who are experiencing disability in different ways, and we want our content, our information, whatever we're creating, to be accessible to all of them. And this relates to the principle of universal design, where it says if we design for everybody, if we design for disability, it actually makes everybody welcome. And let me give you an example of that. The classic example of kind of universal design and disability is the curb cut. Now, the curb cut, there's a picture here on the right. There's a little sidewalk and kind of coming down, for you, there is a street and there's a little ramp that goes between the sidewalk and the street and it was designed for wheelchair users. So you were able to go without having to go over the curb in your wheelchair. You can just go down the ramp. But we realized pretty early on with the curb cut, it helps parents pushing strollers. It helps people pulling wheeled luggage. It helps kids riding bikes. It helps injured people using knee scooters. And the list goes on. There's a lot of people that curb cuts help. And this is a great example of universal design where we design kind of for disability and maximum accessibility really helps a whole bunch of people. Another example is texting was designed really for deaf people to be able to kind of communicate on the phone, and everybody loves texting now. The electric toothbrush was designed for people maybe with limited mobility or limited dexterity in their hands. And now everybody uses an not everybody, but a lot of people use electric toothbrushes. So these are just a couple examples of things that were designed with accessibility in mind that really have a widespread benefit. So we can take those principles and apply them to data. And when it comes to data, we can start again with some statistics. And I pulled these from the National Science Foundation survey of doctorate recipients. And they found that maybe 10 to 15% of people who get doctorates have a disability, one or more disabilities, and it varies a little bit from field to field. But disability, is still prevalent in people who are this is a kind of stand-in for people who are researchers, but disability is prevalent in people who do research. The farther up you go, the fewer disabled people are represented, but we're still here. So you may already work with a disabled peer if you're working in academia. And this shows, again, why disability is important in an academic, in a research setting. And if we're going to be talking about data sharing and reproducibility, we also should be talking about data accessibility as part of this. Deb has a question of what definition of disabled are you using? There's a bunch of different definitions of disabled. I think that you can definitely use the medical definition where you have limited function in one or more areas of your life, say work or home. I think it's much more useful to use a social model of disability where we have an environment where you cannot participate in society because the environment is not designed for you. So a building is not designed for somebody with a wheelchair if it only has stairs. And so you are disabled by the environment. So I think there's we can take from the medical model, which kind of is that clinical limitation, but you can also take from a social model where if we do include things like universal design, we actually remove many of those barriers that disability is um, that face disabled people in our society. So that didn't quite answer your question clearly, but I think it's useful to pull from both. If you actually want a more clinical definition, I actually have it on my desk. Demystifying Disability by Emily Ladau has a really nice background explainer for what it is, what the terminology is, what you should and shouldn't say to disabled people, and it's really good. Okay. So as Amy mentioned early on, we have a new ADA Title II interpretation that goes into effect this month or in a year, depending on kind of the size of your population. The big thing is it is routine under section, I think it's section 508 says all federal government information and technology has to be accessible. And the new ADA interpretation says state and local governments also have to have their web content, mobile apps, websites, et cetera, accessible. And they give the benchmark of WCAG, WCAG 2.1 level AA. And we'll talk about that briefly in a little bit. But basically, anything you put online needs to be accessible. And if you're a public university run by a state, this applies to you. I am a private university. I'm at a private university, so we don't actually have this interpretation apply to us, but it's still a good idea to meet those standards. So as we kind of get down from like state and local governments, public universities, does this impact research data? And I am not a lawyer, but I think there are some pretty compelling cases for when it makes sense that data needs to be made accessible to comply with the ADA. With this new interpretation. And I think one of the cases is when data is shared on a university webpage or in a university data repository. So if you have research data and the university is hosting it, then I think you should probably talk to your lawyers, but I think it's a pretty good bet that you're going to want to strongly think about the new Title II interpretation. So in addition to that scenario of data being hosted on a university website, there's a couple other scenarios that I think require accessible data. For under section 504, if you're doing instruction and that instruction is in a class, or maybe somebody's participating in a research project, you would want to make your data accessible to that specific person for that specific case. We also have under section 508 data that is created or posted by the federal government. There are a lot of stipulations around how government data is handled, and accessibility is part of that. And then I think a really compelling case is if you just want a lot of people, the maximum number of people to be able to understand your data. I think it's really important that we start talking about accessibility as part of reusability. The big thing I want to say before we get into kind of the next step is there are a couple issues when we talk about data accessibility. And the first issue is that data is not just going to be magically accessible and will never need to be touched again, because not all disabilities are the same. So a good example I have here is we have two disabilities. We have a hard of hearing person and an autistic person. And if you have a video with sound, the hard of hearing person is going to want louder audio and the autistic person is going to want quieter audio. Maybe they have a sensory sensitivity. And so these two disabilities conflict. And so this is less of a remediation issue because you can adjust the volume, but we can imagine other scenarios where we create an accessible data set, but there is a particular need from a particular person with a particular disability that we need to remediate that file for, that we need to change that file for, that we may need to make it accessible for that specific person with those specific needs. So when we talk about data accessibility, it's with this caveat in mind that there's no one way to make data 100% accessible for everyone. We're going to do our best. And if someone comes along and says, I need data the specific way for my specific disability needs, then you remediate as necessary. The other caveat that I want to put out there is that accessibility and reusability sometimes conflict. And the things that this is a great example with file formats, and hopefully I'll get to this part, but like some file formats are more accessible and some file formats are more reusable. And which do you choose? So you kind of have to weigh your priorities. Is it really important that this data be as reusable as possible and then I'll remediate as necessary? Or is it more important for this data to be maximally accessible? Because they are not always the same. So remediation is again a possibility that we may need to think through when weighing priorities between accessibility and reusability. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what's available with research data accessibility right now. And I grabbed this picture because I think this is a very nice landscape picture that kind of sums up what's going on with accessibility right now around research data. So we kind of have this dirt patch with little scrubs and maybe a little tree, and there's more trees in the distance, but there's really not much growing here. And there's a little bit growing here, and there's a little bit in the horizon and nearby, and maybe we can start taking those plants and kind of planting them in our little field here. But we still have work to do to make this garden grow or whatever we're growing here. So when it comes to information on accessible research data, there is very minimum guidance. There is a nice data curation network guide that's kind of short, that kind of does a nice overview. The Research Data Access and Preservation Association, I'm literally a co-chair for this. We're putting out a report on Title II, on the ADA, on repositories, on data accessibility. It's coming out probably next month. That will go into more detail on this topic. But basically, what we have right now is a lot of guidance around business documents that we have to extrapolate. And we kind of take business documents and we take reusability principles and we kind of have to meet in the middle to think about research data explicitly. So we're still working as a field to develop this guidance, which means that the educational programs really don't exist yet because the guidance doesn't exist. So this is definitely an area where I would love to see other people working and creating more content and kind of helping grow this little landscape because there's not much here yet. Part of the issue is whose job is this? It's not really clear when we start talking about data accessibility, who's really responsible. So for the ADA, they say, well, the public institution is responsible for all the content that they host. Okay. But when it comes to making data accessible, even if we take data and put it on our university website, is it the researcher who needs to know about accessibility? Is it the librarian's job to teach them and help them? Is it on a data curator to curate that data set before it gets uploaded? Is it on the repository administrator to develop workflows and guidance in their repository? Is it the responsibility of the university because they hold some legal liability? And I'm not a lawyer again, but I think there's some part of this that everybody plays a part. And so we have to kind of get all of these people working together on the same page. And this is a good reminder at this point that if you're thinking about accessibility of data, if you're thinking about accessibility of your repository, it's probably a good idea to talk to your legal counsel at your institution to learn about what's acceptable risk when it comes to data accessibility. So if we don't magically have all our data accessible in our repository at the end of the month, what is okay can we just say that's an archive and not make it accessible and try to do our best going forward? Is it okay to work slowly on it and have a remediation strategy? What do your lawyers think? Because they're the ones who have to defend you in court if somebody says, hey, ADA Title II says this and you're not doing it. I do briefly want to mention data repositories as part of this. I don't really have time to cover this today, but it will be in the RDAP report that is released next month. The good news is when it comes to online platforms, there's a lot of guidance that exists, starting with the WCAG requirements, which is kind of like the baseline, the threshold that you have to meet, but there's more available than that. So the good news is online infrastructure has guidance, data, not so much. But we can start thinking about how we might integrate data accessibility into our repositories. So you could think about having some automated checkers to check accessibility of your data sets when you deposit them. Or having a human check it. You could create guidance in your repository to tell people about accessibility practices. You might want to develop remediation workflows. If someone says, I want to use this data set in your repository, it's not accessible for me, what do they do? What's your process? Who do they contact? What does that look like? So those are a few examples of where we might start thinking about the bridge between accessible data and the data repositories themselves. So overall, we're still kind of thinking about guidance and we're still thinking about education in this area. And part of the issue is we don't really have a strong community around this yet because we have kind of individuals working on this, and we don't have a real sense of ownership quite yet either. There are possibilities for building accessibility into data systems, but basically, I want to start having a wider conversation about this because I think it's really important. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about resources, because if you want to do this, what are the resources that exist that can help you get there? And one of the first things that you can do is actually start with some accessibility checkers. These are pretty easy entry into the accessibility workspace. So you're probably already using Microsoft Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And next time you use them, if you haven't thought about accessibility, I encourage you to go and run that accessibility check and remediate your document before you share it with somebody else, because those checkers are just a really nice, easy way to start. Adobe Acrobat does have accessibility features and a checker, but only in the paid version. So that is not Reader, which is the free version. It's Acrobat. You actually have to pay for it. And PDFs, I will say, are notoriously difficult to make accessible. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but there are resources within Adobe for that. There are also external checkers that you can use. There's a color contrast checker from WebAIM. There's Coblis, which is for color vision deficiency or color blindness. There's Wave for websites. There's just basically a bunch of tools out there that you can find and start using. And these are basically designed to help people get started when they make content to say, oh, maybe you want to tweak it here and there to make your files accessible. But the thing with accessibility checkers is they're not always going to find every problem. So, your regular checker built into Word or Acrobat may be bad at finding color contrast errors, but it may be good at finding images that need alt text, for example. So, maybe not perfect, but a good place to get started if you've never done this work before. Another resource that I really like is the Section 508 webpage. This is basically, I mentioned Section 508 when I said that all government content needed to be accessible. And so what the government did was create a website that basically walked through how to make files accessible in various formats. Nominally Microsoft Word, because Microsoft products have most accessibility features built in. And so the 508 website gives information on Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and PDF, among other things like guidance for captions and transcripts, accessibility of email, equations, social media. So basically, this is the government's own guidance for how to make content accessible. And it's in the context of business documents, but it's still a really helpful starting point if you're like, I don't know how to make an Excel file accessible. Definitely check out Section 504. It's a great resource. And I really like they have videos, but their videos are accessible too. So you can kind of see like what it looks like to make accessible content about accessibility. I have mentioned the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The standard that we're required to meet under the new ADA Title II is WCAG 2.1. They have since published 2.2, but if you're compliant with 2.1, if you're compliant with 2.2, you're also compliant with 2.1 because it's backwards compatible. There is a document there is a subsection of that that applies to non-web documents. This is WCAG 2 ICT, Internet. I don't remember what the ICT stands for. It basically is a repeat of everything that's in WCAG 2, but throws out the stuff that applies to a website that doesn't apply to documents. So you can look at either of them. I kind of look at the whole thing, and it doesn't matter. It's basically the same stuff for documents in particular. And so this is helpful for determining kind of a baseline. And this is like when I talk about recommendations for color contrast, I cite WCAG because it's a really nice baseline standard to where your numbers are, where your metrics should be. There are only a few guides on making accessible data. I mentioned the Data Creation Network Primer. And so it's just basically got a couple paragraphs on spreadsheets, a couple paragraphs on images, but it's a nice kind of background for getting started on how you can make your data into a more accessible file. The RDAP Digitally Accessible Data and Repositories report is coming out. It's going to be in May. I believe we're going to be able to share a draft version for RDAP next week. So if you want a copy of it, you can email me, and I may either be able to share you the draft in a couple weeks, or you will get the full report in May when it's published. We're literally doing last minute edits. And if you're curious about data visualizations, I highly recommend Chartability. This is a great resource that kind of walks you through accessibility principles for data visualizations. I have a little bit of time. I want to kind of talk through some examples of what it looks like for accessibility. I'm gonna skip over the accessibility principles kind of generally, but basically we can take general guidance like what's the guidance on color. We can take those from WCAG. I'm going to skip over that and for time and kind of give you a kind of bigger picture of what it looks like when you start talking about accessibility for specific file types and what the trade-offs are. So let's talk a little bit about spreadsheets. So when it comes to thinking about a data file, one of the easiest rules of thumb, or the most basic rule of thumb, I should say, for accessibility is can a deafblind person with a screen reader access your content? So if you're not familiar with a screen reader, it basically takes whatever's on a computer screen and either reads it out loud or can convert it to Braille if somebody is deafblind and uses a refreshable Braille reader. So this is a very common way for a blind person or a deafblind person to interact with a computer. And if your data set cannot be read out loud by a screen reader, then you need to remediate it. So what this means is if you have content that isn't text, you should have text that comes alongside it that can be read by a screen reader. So text is kind of the default accessible option for a lot of files. So if it's available as text, it's fine. If it's not available as text, you also need to convert it to text and share it alongside the data. So kind of just a basic rule of thumb to get started. So let's look at spreadsheet basics. I didn't cover color. We're going to skip that for today, but I do want to kind of talk about two basic things that we can think about when it comes to accessibility of spreadsheets. And the first is organization. And so we kind of pull from this really amazing article that I love. It's like the best article about spreadsheets of all time. It's by Broman and Wu, Data Organization in Spreadsheets. If you haven't read it, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And I pulled a lot of information on there to basically make your tables clean, make them tidy. You should have a rectangular table with variable names at the top and data all the way down. One data point per cell, no merge cells, these kind of things. And then we can start adding some accessibility principles onto that. So one of the accessibility principles is, one table per file or per spreadsheet tab. If you are somebody who is using a screen reader and you open an Excel spreadsheet, you may not expect to have multiple tables in that spreadsheet because you're going to have to scroll around and try to find them. So you want to have one table per spreadsheet and start it in cell A1. So the screen reader is immediately going to say, this is this particular table, and you don't have to like roam around on a spreadsheet to find other tables that shouldn't exist on that file. The other thing is a lot of that formatting that you might have in a spreadsheet is not going to be able to be read by a screen reader, and so you want to remove it. Similarly, it's not going to be read by if you take a spreadsheet and put it in R. Any formatting doesn't matter to R. It can't read it. It can't interpret it. So if you're encoding some key information as these highlighted cells mean this thing, make another variable. So that can actually be computed on, that can be read by a screen reader. So it's beneficial for both. So here we can start seeing kind of the merging of accessibility and reusability principles, and they work pretty well together. Basically, have nice, clean, tidy spreadsheets. When it comes to variable names, now it gets a little more challenging. And there are, as far as I've seen, there's no clear accessibility guidance for variable names. And so I'm going to steal guidance for hashtags when I talk about variable names. Um, so the general idea is that we want to have variable names that are short but readable. And because if for maximizing reusability, you don't want spaces in file names or in variable names, because it's really a royal pain to deal with spaces in variable names on the command line in R and other programming languages. Just don't do it. So we're looking at hashtag rules, basically, hashtag accessibility rules in this case. So you can use underscores in variable names. I don't recommend dashes because like Python doesn't do dashes very well. I also recommend using camel case or Pascal case. Basically, when you smush your words together, you have to capitalize the first letter of every word. And camel case is the very first word in the variable does not have to be capitalized, and Pascal case says the very first word does have to be capitalized. But note, camel case and Pascal case are not really readable for dyslexic people. So again, we have this trade-off between like what's most reusable and what's most accessible, right? And so you kind of have to figure out how you want to thread this because there really isn't clearly defined guidance in this area. So those are some principles about the spreadsheets themselves. Actually, hold on, there's a question. Do you have a recommendation of capitalizing versus underscores to separate words? I think it depends. I think both are viable. I think the underscores are going to be more readable to dyslexic people. But maybe you have a really long variable names and you want to save space. So probably underscores are better. I'm not 100% sure if every single programming language will handle underscores in a variable name, though. I know most of them do. So it's kind of probably underscores may be better, called pothole case, but it may depend on the context and you may need to remediate. This is where we get into it depends. Pothole case, yes. All right. So we talked about spreadsheet organization. Let's talk a little bit about the files because the file type actually really, really matters for accessibility. And this is really an example. We're talking about spreadsheets, but this example permeates across other data types. So two key types of spreadsheets are Microsoft Excel, and I'm lumping CSV and TSV together because they're comma separated values and tab separated values, and they basically operate the same except for the separator. Now, Microsoft Excel has a ton of accessibility features built in, including that checker that I mentioned earlier. And so if you want an accessible spreadsheet, that's probably the way to go. But Excel is not necessarily the most reusable spreadsheet. It will probably go into other programs, but it's not going to be as easily read in by R, by the command line, things like that. So in that case, if you're looking for reusability, you want a CSV or a TSV, but you lose the accessibility and the formatting that comes with Excel. So we have basically this trade-off between accessibility and reusability. And I'm not going to guide people towards one concrete answer. I think it really depends on the situation and what you're trying to get out of sharing your data. And you kind of have to think through these things and then remediate as needed. So I mostly want to make people aware of kind of what the trade-offs are. And then finally, don't forget documentation. We talk about data sharing. Documentation is necessary to interpret a data set, but even like for general people, data without documentation can be impossible to use, but it's really extra important for disability because if you're trying to navigate a file with a screen reader, that documentation can provide you some overview information that makes it easier to understand that file without having to dig through every last bit of the file. So it can make information about the data set explicit. It can connect people to important related content. And all this context is really important for somebody who may not be able to interact with the data set in the same way as a typical user. Um, this was just kind of an overview. There are obviously more nuances to making files accessible. There's a lot, if you were talking about accessibility of Excel files, there's a whole bunch of things that you would do to make Excel files accessible that I didn't talk about. So if you want to make your files accessible, what do I recommend? I recommend looking up the specifics for your file format and following that guidance where it exists, and then be prepared to remediate as maybe new accessibility features come or somebody has a particular needs, and remediate as needed. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up. I'm almost done. And I want to talk about a couple concrete things you can do to start working towards better data accessibility. So I have a whole list of things. You don't have to do everything on this list, but I want to give you some ideas. So you can talk to people about data accessibility. Start bringing it up in conversation when we talk about data sharing, data reusability, reproducibility. Data accessibility should be part of that conversation. You can meet with your legal counsel about data accessibility and say, what am I required to do? What risks, where's my risk threshold? What should I or shouldn't I do? Learn how to make one data type accessible. If you use a lot of Excel files, if you make a lot of PowerPoints, work to learn how to make that file accessible, and then it becomes just ingrained as part of your workflow. And then I guess I merged into point 4 here is practice making your everyday business documents accessible. Just like now when I make spreadsheets or when I make this PowerPoint, I just incorporate those accessibility principles because I know them and it's routine for me. Discuss with your coworkers how to add accessibility to existing platforms or workflows. Like, what do you have and what systems do you have that you can add accessibility to or improve the accessibility of? You can also work with vendors and request accessibility information. We didn't get into that today, but there are things called VPATs, voluntary product accessibility templates, that not all vendors will have them, and they aren't guaranteed to be 100% correct, but it's a useful starting point to say, what is the accessibility of your product? Give me some information about it. Write an accessibility policy. Where would we like to be with accessibility? What would we like to do? What is our stance on accessibility? What are we working towards? Write it down. And then document your accessibility work. So I think the general consensus, again, not a lawyer, is as we do this work, as we go toward the Title II deadline, I don't think it's possible for us to magically make everything accessible by the end of this month. But if you show that you're doing steps like this, if you show you have a plan for making things accessible and you get sued, you can be like, here's everything we're doing. Here's remediation if as needed stuff, and then we're working our way through this plan. And it is a defense strategy to say, like, we just haven't had time to get to it, we plan to get to it. And it can be a really useful tool to not only legally but also like professionally to say, here's our plan, here's what we're going to do, and here's where we are in the plan. Okay, so that was a lot. You don't have to do all this at once. But I encourage you to start thinking about accessibility, pick something, get started, make a plan to do more, because every small step towards accessibility makes a difference. And so I hope this has been really useful for you. I know we have about 15 minutes. We can have a discussion, and thanks for having me today. It's been great.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for all that information and guidance. I know that people are looking for guidance, and thanks for stepping into the arena and try to lead the way.
It's an interesting time to be working in this field when you're like, these things don't exist. I am making things up on the fly. Cool. I'm not making them up. I'm just like taking two areas that do exist and trying to merge them.
Okay. Um, I'm not sure if we had any questions. I think you addressed them as we went through the talk, but I invite anybody to unmute and ask a question if you would like to.
Hi, yeah, my name's David Pettifor. I work for the University of Notre Dame. So thank you, Kristen. That was a wonderful presentation, and you've reignited some fires in me to meet some accessibility things. So a little background of what we do here: we do a lot of web portals, particularly around research projects, and so a lot of them don't have like a web theme or anything that they are looking to do. And the way that we present data is sometimes challenging, through querying and charts and all sorts of stuff. But since a lot of times we come to the table with a blank template for a theme that gives us an opportunity to meet accessibility standards. And so when you mentioned WCAG 2.2, I was like, yes, that's what we're trying to do. We are currently leaning a lot heavier on AI assisted tools for our web development. And so one thing that we're exploring is how can we set different rules in these stacks to automatically adhere to WCAG 2.2 accessibility standards. So when we ask it, I need you to create a page that does this, or I need you to do a button that does this, it'll automatically follow those standards and just make it easier. Um, it's a work in progress as AI is not it doesn't always follow the rules that you tell it to follow. But that is something that we're trying to do, and I'd encourage others to also explore that as an option to kind of jumpstart. Like you said, it is a lot to take on all at once. But the more that we can lean on tools to do this for us, and then we use outside sources, like you had mentioned, a few of them already, to confirm that what we are pushing out matches and meets those criteria. But I just thought bring that up in
Yeah,
case there
thank
are any
you.
questions or comments.
Yeah, I know for like internet stuff, this is not data specifically, but I know there are a lot of checkers and tools available for development. I just went to the it's DEQUE AxCon conference a couple weeks ago, which was lovely. And I know DQ has a bunch of different tools that they use, that they offer to actually do some like accessibility checking. And I know there are other companies that do this, but it's just a matter of like finding the right tool. But I know that there is quite a large community over there and in other places that are working for, yes, thank you for the link in the chat, um, that are looking at this particular topic. And there are resources available. It's just a matter of finding them.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome anyone else to unmute if you want to ask a question
Hey
or drop
folks,
something.
Bez from Cornell. I just want to sort of restate what I popped in the chat before, that with regards to variable names and making them accessible, that there's a lot of commonality between making things accessible and making them readable. And one of the things that makes code readable is style guides. If you haven't looked at PEP 8, which was one of the big Python ones, it's got a lot of good advice about doing things sensibly. And as long as folks are consistent and sensible and target it for what they're trying to do, having a style guide is a great start at making code intelligible by humans if you're all following the same playbook.
There's actually science behind why a style guide is valuable, and it's that just blanked cognitive load. That's what I'm talking about. So humans can only hold a certain amount of content in their head at one time. This is like the RAM on your computer. And so anytime you can make things more consistent and even, it actually reduces your brain like latching on to those inconsistencies and having to like think about those inconsistencies, and just streamlines everything. And so, a neurotypical person may have a certain amount of cognitive load, and a person with an intellectual disability may have less cognitive load capacity. And so if we streamline things with a style guide, if things are always the same, I think the classic example I get is I'm reading an article and there's 6 figures, and the first 3 figures have green representing good, and the second 3 figures have green representing bad. That adds to cognitive load because I have to think through every time, like, is green good in this case? Is green bad in this case? And it takes away my mental capacity for actually thinking about what the paper is talking about rather than trying to understand the visualization. So when we streamline formatting and when we streamline how things look and how things read, that it's actually really helping with cognitive load. It really helps with specific types of disabilities too. So science.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for the conference link. I'm going to share that with a couple colleagues as well.
It's free. You just have to sign up. And I believe they have all their sessions recorded. So you can go back and look at what they did last year or a couple months ago.
Excellent. And you did mention the RDAP accessibility report that's going to come out. Is emailing you the only way people are going to get it, or is it going to be on the website? Is it
It's
going to be?
going to be promoted. We've already got a list of places to cross promote it. I'm hoping we'll be able to share a draft next week, and then the final will come out in May. But we will definitely do a bunch of cross promotion. But if you want me to email you as soon as it's available, you can email me. Otherwise, if you want to just keep an eye on RDAP, we'll do it that way. Yeah.
Okay. And I will put your email in the notes for people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wendy, I see you.
I don't want to interrupt. Kristen, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to all of this. I especially appreciated your connection between reuse and accessibility, and something we've been working. I'm Wendy Kozlowski from Cornell University Library. One of the things that we've worked here on for a long time is not just the accessibility of those data files that you mentioned. It's really been interesting over the years to see, we're starting to see increased accessibility in the files themselves based on these reuse practices. But one thing we still struggle with is the accessibility of the documentation. And while we are continuing to try to improve templates and guidance about that, I'm wondering what other people are experiencing, and if you would have the ability to talk a little bit about formats. In particular, we're seeing an increase in markdown files for documentation and where they fit in your accessibility schema compared to text files, for example.
I literally just blogged about this last month about excessive. Whoa, let me put this in the chat. So I have lots of thoughts about documentation, particularly documentation file types, because I don't think there's a clear winner here. I think that Word is going to be maximally accessible, but it's not necessarily going to be easily. It's a proprietary file type. We have to pay for that. I didn't mention that when I was giving my talk, but like you have to pay for it. I mean, you can put it in Google and that helps. But I've always recommended readme.txt files because you can open them with any program, but they're not accessible because there's zero formatting in a TXT. And so I feel this tension, and I think that I'm hoping that we develop more infrastructure for Markdown, because Markdown kind of bridges the gap because it provides formatting like headings, which are really an accessibility boon, that we really do need to be using headings in our text documents. But it's also a free program, but it does have a learning curve. So like, I'm not sure there's a clear winner right now. I'm hoping that we can maybe start thinking about Markdown, but I'm not sure it's the right one. I don't know if there's a right thing, but let me see if I can find, there was some research done by Konsten et al. About README files, and they basically looked at READMEs on GitHub. And so this was mostly software, but some data as well. And they found correlation, not causation, but they found that READMEs that were more detailed, that had more things like links and headers, correlated to more reuse. So I think these extra things that we offer in documentation, such as links, such as headers that are not present in TXT files, I think those do actually add value to people's reuse of data sets. So I'm starting to rethink my guidance around recommending a readme.txt file and thinking, are there better ways to do this? Maybe I will switch to Word and offer an accessible file, even if it's proprietary. So I don't have a good answer. I think this is something we should discuss as a field, because I think the file type matters. I think it matters a lot in this case. And I don't think there's a clear answer because each one has its positives and its negatives. I'm happy to hear from other people who have thoughts on this.
So years ago, when I started looking into this, and I don't know whether I'm guilty of not looking at the WCAG, the 2.2 requirements. I don't know. In the early guidance, there was some recommendations for how to make text files at least more machine readable, number of carriage returns, the kind of carriage returns, those kind of things. Do you know if those are still applicable?
I don't actually, because I think that the types of things we're talking about accessibility wise are things like headings. Because if you have a long README file, the only way if it's a TXT, the only way a screen reader can read that is to go through the whole thing. Whereas if you have headings, a screen reader can go section by section and navigate via the headings. So those are actually really important the longer the text document you have. And that doesn't apply to TXTs at all. So I think like some of those things matter, but I think that there's other structures and other accessibility principles that are starting to be more important that show up in like WCAG that probably are more often being discussed. And Cornell does actually, I have seen your guidance. You have some nice guidance on accessibility on your data repository. So shout out to you on that one.
Hey, Wendy, if you wouldn't mind dropping maybe a link in the chat document or in the chat here, we can capture that. That'd be great. And I think we're going to have to leave it there because we are almost at time. Kristen, thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk and for sharing this work and information. We all really appreciate your efforts. Like I said, stepping in the arena. Shout out to you for that. And this is really important work. And as you know, next month is Global Accessibility Month. We usually do this talk in that month, but we moved it forward. So this is an appetizer for a lot of things that are coming up in the CART community next month. So with that, everybody have a great day. Thank you so much for coming. Again, I'm going to say thank you for all of this, and I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. But I look forward to reading that 150-page report.
It's gone long but detailed. It'd be very helpful. But yes,
It will.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Take care. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.